Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stepped out of his beaten-up pickup truck. The desert heat hit him like a wall, but he didn't mind. After 20 years of living in crowded cities, dealing with noisy neighbors and traffic jams, this emptiness felt like freedom. He had spent his entire savings on this small piece of land in the middle of nowhere, complete with a rundown shack that barely qualified as shelter. The real estate agent had warned him about the isolation. "You sure about this, buddy? Nearest town is 40 miles away. No cell service, no internet, just you in the desert." Marcus had smiled and signed the papers anyway. That's exactly what he wanted. He grabbed his duffel bag and a box of supplies from the truck bed. The shack looked even worse up close than it had in the grainy photos online. The wooden walls were weathered gray, with gaps between the boards wide enough to stick his finger through. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the windows was boarded up with plywood, but it had 4 walls and a roof, which was more than he'd had in months. Marcus had been drifting from town to town since his divorce 3 years ago. He'd lost his job, his house, and his wife all within 6 months. Sarah had taken everything in the settlement, claiming he was emotionally unavailable and incapable of real connection. Maybe she was right. He'd tried to start over in different cities, but everywhere felt the same. Crowded, noisy, fake. The shack's door hung crooked on rusty hinges. Inside, dust covered everything like a gray blanket. A small table sat in one corner, and an old metal bed frame leaned against the far wall. The floorboards creaked with every step, and he could see daylight through several holes in the roof. It wasn't much, but it was his. He spent the rest of the day cleaning and organizing his few belongings. He'd brought basic camping gear, canned food, and a solar panel system he'd bought online. The previous owner had left behind a few pieces of furniture and some tools in a storage shed out back. By evening, he had the place somewhat livable. As the sun began to set, Marcus sat on the front step with a can of beans and watched the sky turn brilliant orange and purple. The silence was complete except for the distant call of a coyote. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. No deadlines, no expectations, no one to disappoint. Just him and the endless desert stretching in all directions. He'd chosen this place specifically because the nearest neighbor was supposed to be miles away. The land records showed nothing but empty desert for 20 miles in every direction. That suited him perfectly. He was done with people, done with trying to fit into a world that seemed designed to crush anyone who didn't play by its rules. The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn to the sound of wind rattling the walls. He made coffee on his camp stove and stepped outside to watch the sunrise. The desert was beautiful in its harshness, all red rock and scrub brush stretching to the horizon. He could see why people came here to disappear. He spent the morning fixing the worst of the roof leaks and reinforcing the door. The work felt good after months of sitting in hotel rooms and diners, wondering what to do with his life. His hands remembered the skills his father had taught him years ago, before life got complicated. Around noon, the heat became unbearable, so he retreated inside for a nap. He'd read that desert people learned to rest during the hottest part of the day and work in the early morning and evening. It made sense. The shack stayed reasonably cool with all the windows open and a battery-powered fan running. When he woke in the late afternoon, Marcus decided to explore his property. According to the deed, he owned 40 acres, though it all looked the same to him. Red dirt, scattered rocks, and tough desert plants that somehow survived without rain. He walked in a wide circle around the shack, marking the boundaries in his mind. That's when he noticed something strange. To the east, maybe half a mile away, he could see what looked like green vegetation, trees, maybe even grass. In this desert, that meant only one thing: water. He grabbed a water bottle and headed in that direction, curious despite himself. The walk was harder than it looked. The desert floor was uneven, covered with hidden rocks and holes that could twist an ankle. The heat shimmered off the ground, making everything in the distance look like a mirage. But as he got closer, the green became more distinct. It was real vegetation, and a lot of it. What he found took his breath away. Hidden in a depression between 2 low hills was an oasis. A natural spring bubbled up from underground, creating a small pool surrounded by cottonwood trees and thick grass. The water was crystal clear and cold when he knelt to test it. He couldn't believe such a place existed on his property. Marcus sat in the shade of the trees, listening to the gentle sound of moving water. This changed everything. With a reliable water source, he could actually make this place livable long-term. He could plant a garden, maybe even build a better house eventually. For the first time since buying the land, he felt like he'd made the right decision. As the sun began to set, he reluctantly started back toward the shack. He'd return tomorrow with tools and start planning how to make use of this incredible discovery. Maybe his isolation wouldn't be as complete as he'd thought, but having access to fresh water was worth the trade-off. Walking back in the gathering darkness, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Maybe this desert hideaway would be exactly what he needed to rebuild his life on his own terms. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks settling into a routine. He woke before sunrise, did repairs and improvements while the air was cool, rested during the blazing midday heat, then worked again in the evening. The oasis became his daily destination. He'd discovered a path that made the walk easier, winding between rock formations that provided some shade. Each visit to the water revealed new details. The spring was larger than he'd first realized, with several smaller pools connected by tiny streams. Fish swam in the deeper sections, and he'd seen deer tracks in the mud around the edges. Birds nested in the cottonwoods, filling the air with songs he'd never heard in the city. He'd started bringing tools and supplies to the oasis, planning to build a small shelter there for the hottest days. The trees provided natural cooling, and the sound of flowing water was more peaceful than any air conditioner. He imagined spending entire afternoons reading in the shade, something he hadn't done since college. On this particular morning, Marcus loaded his backpack with lumber and nails. He planned to build a simple lean-to against one of the larger trees. The walk to the oasis had become automatic, his feet finding the easiest path without conscious thought. The desert was teaching him its rhythms, and he was finally learning to listen. But as he crested the small rise that overlooked the oasis, Marcus stopped dead in his tracks. There were people at his water source. 3 figures moved near the main pool, and his first emotion was anger. This was his land, his private refuge. How dare someone trespass on the one place where he'd found peace? He crouched behind a boulder and pulled out the small binoculars he'd started carrying for wildlife watching. What he saw through the lenses made him forget all about property lines and trespassing laws. 3 young women were at the water's edge, and they appeared to be bathing. Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment. He should leave immediately, give them privacy, pretend he'd never seen anything. But something kept him frozen in place. It wasn't just that they were beautiful, though they certainly were. It was that they seemed so perfectly at home in this wild place, as if they belonged here more than he ever could. The tallest of the 3 had long, dark hair that caught the morning sunlight like silk. She moved with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. The second woman was smaller, with curly red hair that bounced as she laughed at something her companion said. The third was somewhere between them in height, with blonde hair braided down her back. They weren't just washing themselves in the pool. They seemed to be playing, splashing each other and talking in voices that carried across the water like music. Their laughter echoed off the rock walls, a sound so joyful it made Marcus's chest ache with loneliness. He realized he hadn't heard genuine laughter in months, maybe years. His marriage had been so cold toward the end that even smiles had become rare. These women radiated a happiness that seemed as natural as the flowing spring itself. Marcus lowered the binoculars, his hands shaking slightly. He needed to leave, needed to respect their privacy and his own dignity. But as he started to back away, a stick cracked under his foot. The sound echoed across the oasis like a gunshot. The women's conversation stopped instantly. Marcus held his breath, pressing himself against the boulder and praying they hadn't heard. But when he risked a glance toward the water, all 3 were looking in his direction. The dark-haired woman shaded her eyes with her hand, scanning the rocks where he was hiding. For a moment that felt like an eternity. Marcus was certain they'd spotted him. His heart hammered against his ribs, and sweat that had nothing to do with desert heat ran down his back. He imagined their screams, their fear, the humiliation of being caught spying like some perverted hermit. But after what felt like forever, the women resumed their conversation. Their voices were more subdued now, and they kept glancing toward his hiding spot. They knew someone was out there, even if they couldn't see him clearly. Marcus waited until they finished bathing and began getting dressed before he carefully retreated. He moved as quietly as possible, taking a longer route back to avoid being seen. His planned shelter construction would have to wait for another day. Right now, he needed to figure out who these women were and what they were doing on his land. Back at the shack, Marcus paced the small space like a caged animal. The encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Not just because he'd been caught spying, but because seeing those women had reminded him of everything he'd been trying to forget. Connection, companionship, the simple pleasure of being around other people who weren't trying to hurt or judge him. He pulled out the property survey he'd received when he bought the land. According to the official documents, the oasis was definitely within his boundaries, but that didn't explain who the women were or where they'd come from. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and he hadn't seen any vehicles or campsites. Maybe they were hikers who'd stumbled upon the water source. But they'd seemed too comfortable, too familiar with the place, and their behavior suggested they'd been there before, knew the area well. The way they'd immediately sensed his presence indicated experience with the desert's sounds and silences. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. He tried to read, to work on repairs, to focus on practical matters, but his mind kept returning to the oasis and the three mysterious women. He told himself it was simple curiosity, but he knew it was more than that. For 3 years he'd convinced himself that solitude was what he needed. No complications, no relationships, no risk of being hurt again. The desert was supposed to be his escape from all of that. But seeing those women had awakened something he'd thought was dead, a longing for human connection that terrified him. As evening approached, Marcus made a decision that surprised him. Tomorrow morning he would return to the oasis, not to spy this time, but to introduce himself properly if the women appeared again. He owned the land after all. It was perfectly reasonable to want to know who was using his water source, but deep down he knew his motives weren't quite that simple. Something about those 3 women had captured his imagination in a way nothing had for years. Maybe it was time to find out if his self-imposed exile was really what he wanted, or just what he'd convinced himself he deserved. Marcus barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the 3 women at the oasis, heard their laughter echoing across the water. He'd rehearsed a dozen different approaches in his mind, from casual friendliness to stern property owner authority. None of them felt right. The truth was, he'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten how to talk to people, especially women. Dawn came too slowly and too quickly at the same time. Marcus made coffee with shaking hands, changed his shirt 3 times, and checked his reflection in the shack's cracked mirror. He looked like exactly what he was, a lonely man who'd been living rough in the desert for weeks. His beard was unkempt, his hair too long, and his clothes bore the permanent dust that came with desert living. He almost talked himself out of going. What if they weren't there? What if they were there but ran when they saw him? What if they thought he was some kind of dangerous drifter? All valid concerns, but not enough to keep him away. Something about yesterday's encounter had awakened a curiosity that wouldn't be ignored. Marcus packed his usual supplies but added a few extra water bottles and some granola bars. If he was going to introduce himself, he might as well be hospitable. The walk to the oasis felt different this morning, charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. As he approached the familiar rise overlooking the water, Marcus heard voices again. His pulse quickened, but this time he didn't hide. Instead, he deliberately made noise as he walked, snapping twigs and scuffing his boots on rocks. He wanted them to know someone was coming. The voices stopped as he crested the hill. All 3 women were there, but they were dressed this time, sitting in the shade of the cottonwoods. They looked up as he appeared, their expressions alert but not afraid. The dark-haired woman stood first, her posture confident and welcoming. "Well, hello there," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the water. "We wondered when you'd finally show yourself." Marcus felt his face redden. So they had known he was watching yesterday. He walked slowly toward the water's edge, his hands held slightly away from his body in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "I'm sorry about yesterday," he said when he was close enough for normal conversation. "I didn't mean to spy. I just wasn't expecting to find anyone here." The redhead laughed, a sound even more musical up close than it had been from a distance. "You looked pretty surprised, all right. Like you'd seen a ghost." 3 ghosts, added the blonde, grinning. "I'm Elena, by the way. This is Rosa." She gestured to the redhead. "And that's Sophia." The dark-haired woman nodded gracefully. "Marcus," he replied, still standing awkwardly at the water's edge. I own this land. Just bought it a few weeks ago." "We know," Sophia said, settling back onto her blanket. "We saw you moving into the old shack. Been wondering when you'd find the spring." Marcus blinked in surprise. "You've been watching me?" "Hard not to notice a new neighbor out here," Rosa said. "Sound carries far in the desert. We heard your truck, saw your lights at night. But where do you live?" Marcus asked. "I was told this was all empty land for miles around." The three women exchanged glances that Marcus couldn't quite interpret. Elena patted the ground beside her blanket. "Why don't you sit down? You're making us nervous standing there like you're ready to run." Marcus hesitated, then lowered himself onto the soft grass. It felt strange to be sitting with other people after weeks of solitude. The women seemed completely at ease, as if entertaining strangers by remote desert springs was something they did regularly. "We live about 2 miles that way." Sophia pointed vaguely to the east. "There's a canyon with some caves. Very comfortable once you fix them up properly." "Caves?" Marcus couldn't hide his skepticism. "You live in caves?" "Don't sound so shocked," Rosa laughed. "People have been living in caves for thousands of years. These ones stay cool in summer, warm in winter. Better than most apartments I've had." Marcus looked at the three women more carefully. Their clothes were simple but well made, their hair clean and carefully styled. They didn't look like homeless drifters or survivalist extremists. They looked like normal women who'd chosen an unusual lifestyle. "How long have you been living out here?" he asked. "About 2 years," Elena said. "We came out for a camping trip and just never left. Sometimes the desert calls to people, you know?" Marcus nodded slowly. He did know, though he'd never heard it described that way. "But what do you do for money?" "For supplies? We have our ways," Sophia said mysteriously. "Rosa makes jewelry that sells well in the tourist towns. Elena does freelance writing. I paint landscapes that collectors seem to like. And we grow a lot of our own food," Rosa added. "The desert's more generous than most people think if you know how to work with it." Marcus found himself relaxing despite his nervousness. These women weren't threatening or strange. They were just people who'd found a different way to live, not so different from what he was trying to do himself. "What about you?" Elena asked. "What brought you out here to buy a falling-down shack in the middle of nowhere?" The question hit closer to home than Marcus was prepared for. He'd spent weeks avoiding thinking about his reasons for coming here, focusing instead on practical matters like shelter and water. But something about these women's easy acceptance made him want to be honest. "I needed to get away from everything," he said finally. "My life fell apart a few years ago. Lost my job, my marriage, my house. I've been drifting ever since, trying to figure out what comes next." "And you thought the desert might have some answers?" Sophia asked gently. "I thought the desert might let me stop asking questions for a while," Marcus replied. Rosa leaned forward, her green eyes serious. "Has it worked?" Marcus considered the question. 3 weeks ago, he would have said yes. The isolation had brought a kind of peace, a break from the constant pressure to be something he wasn't. But sitting here with these three women, he realized that running away had only postponed the real questions, not answered them. "I'm not sure anymore," he admitted. The women exchanged another of those meaningful glances. Elena smiled and stood up, brushing grass from her clothes. "Well, you're welcome to visit any time," she said. "The spring doesn't belong to any of us, really. Water should be shared. Same with conversation," Rosa added. "It gets pretty quiet out here sometimes." As the three women gathered their things to leave, Marcus felt a familiar panic rising in his chest. He'd just found them. Just started to remember what it felt like to talk to other people. He wasn't ready for them to disappear again. "Will you be here tomorrow?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Sophia smiled over her shoulder as they headed toward the eastern rocks. "Probably. We come here most mornings when it's cool." Marcus watched them go until they disappeared behind a boulder formation. Then he sat alone by the spring, listening to the water and trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in months, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the oasis early, carrying a thermos of coffee and some homemade biscuits he'd managed to produce in his camp oven. He felt foolish bringing gifts like some nervous suitor, but he couldn't help himself. The prospect of conversation with other human beings had become the highlight of his day. The three women were already there, setting up what looked like a more elaborate camp than yesterday. Elena had brought a sketch pad and was drawing the way morning light fell across the water. Rosa was stringing colorful beads into intricate patterns, her fingers moving with practiced speed. Sophia sat cross-legged on a blanket, reading from a thick paperback book. "Coffee?" Marcus offered, holding up the thermos. "You're officially our favorite neighbor," Rosa declared, setting aside her beadwork. "We've been making do with instant coffee for weeks." As they shared the coffee and biscuits, Marcus found himself studying the women more closely. Yesterday, he'd been too nervous to notice details, but now he could see that each had a distinct personality that showed in everything from posture to clothing choices. Elena was clearly the artist of the group. Her clothes were practical but chosen with an eye for color and texture. She moved gracefully, with the careful observation of someone trained to see. When she spoke, it was in measured sentences, as if she weighed each word carefully. Rosa was more animated, her hands constantly in motion, whether she was working on jewelry or just talking. Her red hair seemed to match her energy level, curling wildly in the desert humidity. She laughed easily and asked direct questions that might have seemed intrusive from anyone else. Sophia was the quietest, but Marcus sensed she missed nothing. Her dark eyes held an intelligence that made him feel slightly nervous, as if she could see through whatever facade he might try to maintain. When she did speak, the others listened carefully. "So what did you do before?" Elena asked, sipping her coffee. "Before the desert, I mean." "I was an accountant," Marcus said, immediately feeling the inadequacy of the answer. "Corporate tax preparation, mostly. Nothing very exciting. But you built that shelter at your place pretty well," Rosa observed. "Those aren't accountant hands." Marcus looked down at his calloused palms, surprised she'd noticed. "My dad was a carpenter. Taught me the basics when I was young. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed working with my hands until I got out here." "The desert has a way of reminding us who we really are," Sophia said softly. "Underneath all the layers we pile on. Is that what happened to you three?" Marcus asked. "The desert showed you who you really were." The women exchanged glances again, that silent communication that suggested years of close friendship. Elena set down her sketch pad and looked directly at Marcus. "We were all running from something when we met," she said. "I'd just gotten out of an abusive relationship. Rosa had lost her job and her apartment in the same week. Sophia was dealing with family pressure to be something she wasn't. "We met at a women's shelter in Phoenix," Rosa continued. "All three of us were pretty much at rock bottom. The counselor there suggested we try a wilderness therapy program, camping trip to help us get our bearings. Best therapy any of us ever had," Sophia added. "Being out here stripped away all the noise, all the expectations. We could just be ourselves without worrying about what anyone else thought." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "That's part of what drew me here, too. I was so tired of trying to be what other people wanted me to be." "What did your wife want you to be?" Elena asked gently. The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd barely mentioned his marriage, but somehow Elena had picked up on the pain there. He took a long sip of coffee, buying time to think. Successful, I guess. Ambitious. She wanted someone who would climb the corporate ladder. Make more money, buy a bigger house. He paused, staring into the clear water of the spring. "I tried, but I was never very good at the game. Too honest, maybe. Too willing to actually do the work instead of just talking about it." "Sounds like she married the wrong person," Rosa said bluntly. "Maybe we both did," Marcus replied. "I thought I wanted the same things she did. House in the suburbs, 2 cars, retirement fund. It took losing it all to realize I'd never actually been happy with any of it." The conversation continued as the morning progressed. Marcus found himself talking more than he had in months, sharing stories about his childhood, his failed marriage, his aimless wandering after the divorce. The women listened without judgment, occasionally sharing their own experiences. Rosa had been a social worker before burning out completely. 20 years of trying to save people who didn't want to be saved, she explained. "I finally realized I needed to save myself first." Elena had worked as a graphic designer for advertising agencies, creating images to sell products she didn't believe in. "I was designing my life away, selling other people's dreams while ignoring my own." Sophia had been a teacher, but her conservative family had pressured her to quit when they discovered she was gay. "They wanted me to be someone I could never be," she said simply. "Out here I can just be Sophia. That's enough." As the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot, the women began packing up their things. Marcus felt the familiar pang of loneliness approaching, but this time Rosa had a suggestion. "Why don't you come see our place?" she offered. "It's not far and it stays cool even in the afternoon." Besides, Sophia makes amazing lunch from desert plants. Marcus hesitated. Visiting their home felt like crossing a line somehow, moving from casual acquaintances to something more like friendship. After 3 years of avoiding exactly that kind of connection, the prospect was both appealing and terrifying. "I don't want to intrude," he said. "You wouldn't be," Elena assured him. "We don't get many visitors out here. It would be nice to have someone new to cook for." Marcus looked at the 3 women, all waiting for his answer with friendly expectation. For a moment he could imagine saying no, walking back to his shack, returning to the safe isolation he'd cultivated so carefully. But something had changed in the past 2 days. The idea of spending the afternoon alone suddenly seemed less appealing than the risk of human connection. "I'd like that," he said finally. As they walked east toward the hidden canyon, Marcus realized he was taking another step away from the man who'd bought a desert shack to hide from the world. Where that journey might lead, he had no idea. But for the first time in years, the uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. The walk to the women's home led through terrain Marcus had never explored, winding between red rock formations that grew taller and more dramatic with each step. What had looked like empty desert from his shack revealed itself to be full of hidden passages and secret places. The women moved confidently through the maze of stone, following paths that were invisible to his untrained eye. "It's all about learning to read the landscape," Elena explained when Marcus commented on the hidden routes. "The desert shows you its secrets if you pay attention long enough." After 20 minutes of walking, they arrived at what appeared to be a solid rock wall rising 30 feet into the air. But as they got closer, Marcus could see a narrow opening, barely wide enough for one person to pass through sideways. "Welcome to our neighborhood," Rosa said with a grin, gesturing toward the opening. Beyond the entrance, the passage opened into a natural amphitheater carved from red sandstone. The walls curved up and around, creating a protected space about the size of a large house. Several cave openings were visible at different levels, connected by natural ledges and carefully constructed stone steps. "This is incredible," Marcus breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "How did you find this place?" "Accident," Sophia said, climbing nimbly up a set of stone steps. "We were exploring, got caught in a sudden rainstorm and ducked in here to wait it out. Realized we'd found something special." The caves had been transformed into comfortable living spaces with creativity and hard work. Solar panels were discreetly mounted on the canyon walls, providing power for LED lights and small appliances. Rainwater collection systems channeled precious moisture into storage tanks. Gardens grew in terraced plots, taking advantage of the morning sun and afternoon shade. "This must have taken months to set up," Marcus said, examining the clever engineering that made desert cave dwelling not just possible, but comfortable. "About a year of steady work," Elena said, leading him to what was obviously the main living area. "But we had time and motivation. Amazing what you can accomplish when you're not spending 40 hours a week making someone else rich." The main cave had been divided into sections with hanging curtains and carefully placed furniture. A kitchen area featured a gas camping stove and a surprisingly well-stocked pantry. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with everything from survival guides to poetry collections. Comfortable chairs and cushions created a cozy seating area around a small fire pit. "The smoke goes up through a natural chimney," Rosa explained, noticing Marcus studying the setup. "Perfect ventilation. Stays warm in winter without getting smoky." Sophia was already preparing lunch, mixing greens and vegetables that Marcus didn't recognize. "Desert salad," she explained. "Prickly pear pads, lamb's quarters, purslane. More nutritious than anything you'll find in a supermarket." As they ate, Marcus learned more about how the 3 women had built their unconventional life. They grew much of their own food using permaculture techniques adapted for desert conditions. They collected rainwater and rationed carefully, supplementing with trips to the oasis. Solar power and careful conservation met their modest electrical needs. "What about money?" Marcus asked. "You mentioned selling jewelry and art, but how does that work out here?" "We make periodic trips to town," Elena explained. "Usually one of us goes while the others stay to maintain things here. Rosa's jewelry sells well at the craft fairs. My paintings find buyers through a gallery in Sedona. Sophia writes freelance articles for outdoor magazines. Plus, we spend almost nothing," Rosa added. "No rent, no utilities, no car payments. Once you get set up, the overhead is practically zero." Marcus was impressed despite himself. What had seemed like an impossible lifestyle from the outside turned out to be carefully planned and efficiently executed. These women had created something he'd never thought possible, true independence from the systems that had once controlled his life. "Don't you ever get lonely?" he asked, "or bored?" The three women laughed simultaneously, a sound that echoed pleasantly off the canyon walls. "Lonely? With these two around?" Sophia gestured at her companions. "I get more social interaction than I ever did in the city. Real conversation, not just small talk about the weather." "And bored?" Elena shook her head. "There's always something to do. Maintaining the water systems, tending the gardens, creating art. Plus, the desert changes constantly. Different seasons, different weather, different wildlife. You just have to learn to see it." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself helping with various tasks around the canyon home. He adjusted a solar panel mount that had been giving Rosa trouble, using skills he'd learned from his father. He helped Sophia harvest vegetables from the garden, learning to identify edible desert plants. He sat quietly while Elena worked on a painting, amazed by her ability to capture the subtle colors of desert light. It was the most productive and satisfying afternoon he'd had in months. But more than that, it felt natural in a way his old life never had. Working with his hands, contributing to something meaningful, being part of a community that functioned on cooperation rather than competition. "You're good at this," Rosa observed as Marcus finished repairing an irrigation line that had been leaking. "The practical stuff, I mean. We could use someone with your skills around here." Marcus looked up from his work, surprised by the suggestion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe isolation isn't what you really need," Elena said gently. "Maybe what you need is the right kind of community." The idea hit Marcus like a physical blow. For 3 years, he'd been convinced that solitude was his only path to healing. People meant complications, expectations, the possibility of being hurt again. But sitting here in this hidden canyon, surrounded by individuals who'd chosen authenticity over conformity, he began to wonder if he'd been wrong. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm pretty damaged goods these days. Not sure I'd be good company for anyone." "We're all damaged goods," Sophia said matter-of-factly. "That's what brought us together in the first place. The question is whether you want to stay broken or start healing." As evening approached, Marcus knew he needed to head back to his shack. But the thought of leaving this warmth and companionship for his lonely shelter felt like a step backward. The women seemed to sense his reluctance. "You're welcome anytime," Elena said as they walked him back to the canyon entrance. "Seriously, whether you want to visit or you want to think about something more permanent." "More permanent?" Marcus stopped walking. Rosa grinned. "There are other caves. Plenty of room for the right kind of neighbor." The walk back to his shack gave Marcus time to think about what he'd experienced. The cave community wasn't just an alternative lifestyle. It was a different way of being human, based on cooperation instead of competition, authenticity instead of performance, connection instead of isolation. But it also meant taking risks he wasn't sure he was ready for. Trusting people again, making himself vulnerable, possibly getting hurt. As he approached his ramshackle shelter, Marcus realized he had a choice to make that would determine the rest of his life. Standing in the doorway of his shack, looking out at the endless desert that had been his refuge for weeks, Marcus felt the weight of possibility pressing against his chest. The isolation that had once felt like freedom now seemed like a prison of his own making. He'd spent so long protecting himself from the risk of connection that he'd forgotten its rewards. That night, he lay awake on his narrow cot, staring up through the holes in the roof at stars that seemed brighter than ever before. For the first time since arriving in the desert, he wasn't thinking about what he was running from. Instead, he was thinking about what he might be running toward. Marcus spent 3 days wrestling with the decision. He walked to the oasis each morning, meeting the 3 women for coffee and conversation, but avoided any mention of Rosa's suggestion about the caves. The women didn't push, seeming to understand that he needed time to process what he'd seen and felt in their canyon home. On the 4th morning, he woke to the sound of wind howling around his shack with unusual ferocity. When he stepped outside, the air was thick with dust and the sky had taken on an ominous yellow tinge. A desert storm was building, the kind that could last for days and make travel dangerous. Marcus had experienced smaller dust storms since arriving, but nothing like this. The wind was strong enough to rattle his walls and send tumbleweeds bouncing across the landscape like bowling balls. He secured everything he could and settled in to wait it out, hoping his makeshift repairs would hold. By noon, the storm had intensified to the point where he could barely see 10 feet beyond his windows. The constant noise of wind and flying debris made it impossible to concentrate on anything. Worse, he began to notice water dripping through several places in his roof, where the repairs had failed under the storm's assault. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus realized his situation was becoming serious. Water was pooling on the floor despite his efforts with buckets and tarps. The wind had torn away part of his solar panel setup, leaving him without power. Most concerning of all, the storm showed no signs of letting up. He was sitting in the driest corner of his shack, wrapped in a blanket and wondering if he should try to make it to his truck, when he heard voices outside. Through the howling wind, he could barely make out someone calling his name. Marcus opened the door to find all 3 women standing in his yard, leaning into the wind and squinting against the flying dust. They were wrapped in heavy clothing and carrying backpacks, clearly prepared for the storm. "We came to check on you," Elena shouted over the noise. "This storm's going to get worse before it gets better." "Your roof's not going to hold much longer," Rosa added, pointing at the obvious sags in the structure. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to his eyes. After years of having no one who cared enough to check on him, here were 3 people who'd braved a dangerous storm to make sure he was safe. "Come back with us," Sophia said, having to repeat herself twice to be heard. "The canyon's completely protected from wind. You can ride this out in comfort." Marcus looked back at his failing shelter, then at the 3 women who were offering him sanctuary. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. His attempts at isolation were literally falling apart, while community and connection offered safety and warmth. "Let me grab some things," he said. The journey back to the canyon was treacherous but manageable with experienced guides. The women knew exactly which routes would be sheltered from the worst of the wind, and they moved with the confidence of people who'd learned to work with the desert rather than against it. Once inside the canyon, the contrast was remarkable. The high walls blocked most of the wind, creating a pocket of relative calm in the midst of the chaos outside. Solar panels and water collection systems had been designed to handle storms like this, and the caves remained perfectly comfortable. "Desert weather can be brutal if you're not prepared for it," Elena said as she made tea for everyone. "But it can also be beautiful. You'll see tomorrow morning, assuming this blows through by then." "How long have you been planning this rescue mission?" Marcus asked, settling into one of the comfortable chairs. "Since yesterday," Rosa admitted. "We've been through storms like this before. That old shack of yours isn't built for real weather." Marcus realized they'd been looking out for him from the beginning, watching and worrying from a distance while giving him the space he seemed to need. The knowledge filled him with warmth that had nothing to do with being out of the wind. The storm raged for 2 days. Marcus slept in a spare cave that had been set up as a guest room and spent his waking hours learning more about how the community functioned. He helped with cooking, maintenance tasks, and storm preparations. More importantly, he experienced what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. On the second evening, as they sat around the fire listening to the wind finally beginning to die down, Sophia asked the question Marcus had been expecting. "So what are you thinking about all this?" she said gently. "About staying, I mean." Marcus stared into the flames, gathering his thoughts. "I'm thinking that I came out here to find myself," he said finally. "But maybe I was looking in the wrong place. Maybe you don't find yourself in isolation. Maybe you find yourself in connection with the right people. And maybe," Elena added softly, "healing happens faster when you're not trying to do it alone." The next morning dawned crystal clear, the air so clean and bright it almost hurt to look at. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a desert that seemed washed and renewed. Marcus walked to the canyon entrance and looked out at his distant shack, which was visible as a small dark speck against the red landscape. He could see even from this distance that the roof had partially collapsed. His attempt at solitary living had literally fallen apart. But instead of feeling defeated, he felt liberated. The universe had made the decision for him in the most dramatic way possible. When he returned to the main cave, the 3 women were waiting with knowing smiles. "So," Rosa said, "ready to look at some real estate?" Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls with a joy he'd almost forgotten he was capable of feeling. "Show me what you've got." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the doorway of his new cave home, watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and rose. His space was simple but comfortable, furnished with handmade furniture and solar-powered conveniences. More importantly, it was part of a community that had become the family he'd never known he needed. The lonely drifter who had bought a desert shack to hide from the world was gone, replaced by a man who'd learned that true solitude wasn't about being alone. It was about being comfortable enough with yourself to open up to others. The desert had taught him that lesson in the most unexpected way. Through 3 extraordinary women who'd shown him that sometimes the thing you're running from is exactly what you need to find. As Rosa emerged from her cave to start the morning coffee, followed by Elena with her sketchpad and Sophia with a book of poetry, Marcus smiled and stepped out to join them. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and wild and free. But he was no longer lost in its emptiness. He had found his place, his people, and himself.